Have you ever wondered what shows are like in foreign countries, but the language barrier is what stopped you from giving them a chance? My name's Maggie, and I host the podcast, Have You Seen It?, where I talk about TV shows from countries all around the world. If you're like me, you spend more time on Netflix looking for something to watch than actually watching something. So if you don't want to spend time scrolling through Netflix or even Hulu, check out my podcast for some show suggestions. I talk about the plots, tell you who the cast is, what I liked and what I didn't like about the shows, and I also throw in some fun facts about each country, tell you where in the world the show takes place, how close they are to any other shows that I've already covered, mention any cultural differences or similarities that I noticed, and my favorite part are the words and phrases that I picked up while watching these shows. You can check out Have You Seen It on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcast, and most other places you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram at officialhysi, that's OFFICIALHYSI, and make sure to like the Facebook page at facebook.com/officialhysi. Let me help you find your new favorite show.
Hey friends, guess who's going to CrimeCon UK? CrimeCon, the world's #1 true crime event, is coming back to London from Saturday the 10th to Sunday the 12th of June 2023. Get inside the mind of serial killers and psychopaths, learn from leading criminologists, hear from the families and survivors, meet your favorite true crime podcasters, immerse yourself in forensic evidence, and delve deeper into unsolved crimes. CrimeCon is the ultimate true crime weekend partnered by CBS Reality, the expert-led true crime TV channel. I will be there, so come and join me. Use quote consequence for a special 10% discount. Tickets are on sale now. For more information, visit crimecon.co.uk and use code consequence to save 10%. If you love true crime, then you need to go. There's going to be content creators with more than 30 of your favorite podcasters, including me. True crime YouTubers, there'll be a live recording studio with audiences. Join me at CrimeCon UK. Go to crimecon.co.uk and use code consequence to save 10% off on your tickets. I can't wait to see you there. Hey friends, I wanted to let you know about an amazing opportunity. I am going to be joined by several of my favorite podcasters in a live show in Albuquerque, New Mexico on March 5th, 2023 from 4 p.m. until 7 p.m. The event's going to be at the Rio Bravo Brewing Company in downtown Albuquerque, and you can buy tickets using the link in the show notes below. Patrons and Apple subscribers save 50% on these tickets. I'm going to be joined by my friend Josh Hallmark from the show True Crime Bullshit, by Lainey Hobbs from True Crime Cases with Lainey, by Crime Lines with Charlie from Crime Lines, and the amazing butter-voiced crooner Nina Instead from Already Gone. We're going to give you a fun night of true crime. We're going to talk about cases. There will be some advocacy happening, and we'll have time for a meet and greet and a little chat afterwards. So don't forget to buy your ticket. Use the link in the show notes below. All right. I look forward to seeing you there. Let's get into the episode. I want to thank Jackie Moranty for her work researching and writing this episode. During the 80s, 6 priests, including Father Rivera, were murdered across the southwestern United States and Montana. For many years, it was suspected that their deaths could have all been linked in some way. I want to talk about the possibilities and the myths surrounding the connections between Father Reynaldo and these 5 other priests. There are distinct differences not only in miles, but in who these men were, who they claimed to be, and the connections that seem to get thinner and thinner as one digs deeper and deeper into Father Reynaldo's murder investigation. I'm Eric Carter-Landin, and this is True Consequences. These priests were all greatly valued in their communities as ministers of faith. Their parishioners feel their loss to this day. Please keep this in mind as I tell you their stories. Father Patrick Ryan was 51 years old and a parish priest in the small town of Denver City, Texas. Father Paddy, as he liked to be called, was born in Doon, Ireland, and became a priest in 1949. In 1981, he was the parish priest at St. William's Catholic Church. He lived alone in the parsonage beside the church and was the only priest for Denver City and the nearby town of Plains, Texas. He was beloved by his congregation, and the entire town was rocked by his murder. Father Paddy was found beaten to death in a hotel room in Odessa, Texas on the 21st of December, 1981. He was not identified until the 26th, when word passed through law enforcement that parishioners from the church had filed a missing persons report when he didn't show up to Mass on Christmas Eve. He had checked into the Sand and Sage Motel under an assumed name with a false address and license plate number. The cleaning woman found his body on the 21st when she went in to clean the room. He was found face down on the floor of the room. He was nude. There were beer cans and cigarette butts all over the room, and it was in shambles. It looked like there had been a struggle. The television was broken, the phone was ripped out of the wall, the AC unit dangled from the cord. Father Ryan was covered in defensive wounds. A long gash from a knife was across his buttocks. His hands were tied behind his back with a sock. And despite there being neighbors that were checked into rooms next to him, nobody heard anything. Once the investigation began, it was found that Father Ryan had left his dinner on the stove, beef and potatoes. When the police found it, the meal was cold. The stove was off. It looked like he had planned to only step away for a few minutes. He had possibly been called out to help a parishioner. Again, remember, he was the only parish priest between Denver City and Plains. So if someone was calling for help, Father Ryan would go to them. His car was found in Hobbs, New Mexico, where it had been parked at the Moose Lodge since the day of his murder. Fingerprints were taken from the car, but there were no matches made. Father Paddy was known to pick up hitchhikers and give them rides wherever they wanted to go, and for a while, it was suspected that one of the people he picked up might have murdered him. James Henry Reyes was convicted of Father Paddy's murder on June 10, 1983. Reyes maintains his innocence to this day, and the Innocence Project has taken over his case. Father Ryan wasn't openly gay, but he was seeking out affairs. He had a brief affair with Reyes. Reyes confessed to Father Ryan's murder a year after his death, but later recanted his confession. He had time-stamped receipts and a traffic ticket that put him 200 miles away in New Mexico on the day that Father Ryan was killed. Father Ryan had spent time at Jemez Springs in New Mexico at Servants of the Paraclet. Servants of the Paraclet is a parish that ministers to priests who have difficulties in their lives. These are not limited to pedophilia. They include alcoholism, drug abuse, depression, self-harm, and in the 70s and 80s, homosexuality. Father Ryan was never accused of abuse, but in the 70s and 80s, homosexuality was seen as a problem in the church, and many priests who wanted to hide their sexuality would end up at Servants of the Paraclet to receive guidance. Not all priests who experienced personal problems were sent to Servants of the Paraclet. Some volunteered to go. Father Ryan was beloved in his community, but it's thought that he struggled with his sexuality and sought guidance voluntarily. Father Benjamin Carrier was a parish priest at Our Lady of Light in Descanso, California. This church was one of the more liberal churches of the time and would welcome transients through their doors, giving them food, shelter, and guidance. In 1981, a year before his death, he received the Bishop Buddy Award. His colleagues described him as a dedicated, selfless man who was given in lifeblood for the love of others. Father Carrier was a drug abuse counselor for the church. He was 54 years old when he died. A man of small stature, he had been warned by several parishioners, friends, and fellow priests to be careful when picking up hitchhikers. But Father Carrier insisted that giving rides to strangers was part of his mission. On November 10, 1982, Father Carrier's body was found in a hotel room at the El Rancho Motel in Yuma, Arizona. He had died of asphyxiation. His body was found nude and his hands were bound behind his back with electrical tape. His wallet and his 1981 Toyota pickup were missing. His pickup was later found in Las Vegas, 2 days after his body had been found in the motel room. His wallet was never recovered. Father Carrier was seen with 2 men the day before his death. One of the men had a cane with a skull on the hilt. They were described as white males in their early 30s. Both were around 5 foot 6 inches tall. Composite sketches of the men were later made, but no one has ever identified them. One of the men was seen by the clerk at the motel when Father Carrier went inside to pay for a room for 2 people that day. It was thought that he had offered the men a room and paid for it out of his own pocket before intending to return home to California. Reverend James Otis Anderson was an Episcopal priest at St. John's Episcopal Church in Townsend, Montana. He was last seen driving east on Highway 12 toward White Sulphur Springs around 8 a.m. on the morning of June 13, 1982. There was no indication that he would be gone for very long. The sermon that he was preparing for that evening's service was on his desk waiting for his return. The rest of his belongings were right where he put them, with few exceptions. His address book, a prized Afghan, and a pistol were missing. He was reported missing when he failed to show up to officiate the services that evening. After his disappearance, none of his bank accounts or credit cards were ever used. Reverend Anderson had been experiencing some personal difficulties at the time. He and his wife were separated and preparing for divorce. This was triggering a custody battle over the children. He was having trouble at work also and could have been facing termination from the church. His wife said that at the time he was acting strangely and had become distant and uncommunicative. She said this was part of the reason for the divorce. 6 months before their separation, Reverend Anderson had changed the name of the beneficiary on his life insurance policy from his wife to St. John's Episcopal Church. His odd behavior combined with the struggles he was having in his life led police to believe that he had committed suicide, though his body was never found. The idea that he just walked away from his life was also floated, but some other circumstances around his disappearance have never allowed law enforcement to completely believe that he wasn't murdered. His 1975 Volkswagen Scirocco was found in October of 1982 in a heavily wooded area in White's Gulch, northeast of Townsend. The car was completely hidden by bushes and appeared to be parked there on purpose. During searches for his body, the car was not visible from the road, the trail, or air. About a half mile away from the vehicle, they found Reverend Anderson's cap, eyeglasses, prayer book, Old Testament Bible, and his clerical collar. The items were found on a ridge overlooking Townsend. His wife would later tell investigators that he wasn't a very good driver and wouldn't be able to maneuver the road to the area where his car was found. The road was steep and winding and would require more driving skill than Reverend Anderson was capable of. She also told investigators that he adored his kids and would never hurt them in that way. No sign of his body was ever found. On December 4th, 1982, a man walked into the Sacred Heart Church in Boise, Idaho. The man was tall, blonde, stocky, and had deeply tanned skin as if he had been spending time in the sun. He was in his late 30s or early 40s and wore a turquoise bolo tie, a black button-down shirt, and jeans with a brown belt. His belt buckle held a 100 peso coin. He was there for confession. But because it was Saturday, just before Mass, he had to wait for the confessional to open up. As 6 o'clock neared, the church began to fill up. A parishioner looking for a seat in the church found the man lying on the floor in front of a pew with blood coming from his mouth and nose. She reached down to feel for a pulse, but the man was cold. It was later found that he had taken cyanide tablets and ended his own life. When police checked his wallet, there was no identification. There was $1,900 in cash with a note that read, "In the event of my death, the enclosed currency should give more than adequate compensation for my funeral or disposal of my remains. Prefer to be cremated. What is left over? Please take this as a contribution to this church. God will see your honesty in this. Signed, W.M.L. Toomey." The man was never identified. His fingerprints never showed up in any databases, and no one claimed his body. He was buried in a potter's field in Boise. William Toomey was an alias that the man had used in the note. It's been speculated that the name is close to R.J. Toomey, a company that makes clothing for clergy. It was thought that the man had some connection to the church, either as a parishioner or possibly he was a former priest. People have speculated that he had been abused by a priest. The belt buckle with a 100 peso coin had been traced back to a souvenir shop in Arizona. The man had recently spent time in the Southwest. The connection to this man between Father Reynaldo, Father Ryan, and Father Carrier was investigated extensively, but nothing came of it. For many years, police thought the man may have killed all 3 of them, but again, there was never any proof of that. The lead was a dead end in all 3 murders. Father John Kerrigan had only been pastor of Sacred Heart Parish in Ronan, Montana for 2 days. On the evening of July 21st, 1984, Father Kerrigan walked into Denault's Bakery on 4th Avenue Southwest in Ronan at about 11 p.m. Despite the cold, he was wearing red shorts, a white t-shirt, and tennis shoes. He had been out for a walk and stopped by the bakery to chat with the people who were gathered there on his way home. The church was located right across the street from the bakery, and Father Kerrigan lived in the rectory. The following day, he was to deliver his first sermon at Sacred Heart. Mass was scheduled to begin at 5:30, but Father Kerrigan never made an appearance. Parishioners called the rectory, but there was no answer. The following day, July 23rd, they called the police and filed a missing persons report for Father John Kerrigan. On July 24th, a woman who sold fruit on the side of the highway near Flathead Lake was setting up her stand when she found Father Kerrigan's blood-soaked clothes neatly folded on the side of the road. She found his shirt, shoes, and a windbreaker. They were not the clothes he was wearing the night before when he visited the bakery. A $100 bill was found inside his shirt pocket. Hair found on the clothing matched Father Kerrigan. His car was found a week later on a hill overlooking Polson. The car was found on Skyline Drive near some radio towers, several miles from the rectory and about 3 miles from where his clothes were found. The car had been wiped of fingerprints, but there were copious amounts of blood on the front seat, the passenger side door, and the passenger side floorboard. There was also a bloody pillow and a bloody shovel in the trunk, along with Father Kerrigan's wallet containing roughly $1,000. In addition to this, police found a bloody coat hanger that had been bent into an oval shape. His keys were found about 30 yards from the car, hidden in the weeds. His body has never been found, but based on the amount of blood on the clothing and in the car, it was assumed that he was murdered. Several suspects were interviewed in connection with his death, including 2 escapees from the Swan River Youth Camp. The youth camp was a minimum security facility that held prisoners aged between 16 and 25 years of age. 2 of the inmates escaped the camp on the same day of Father Kerrigan's disappearance. One of them had been implicated in the murder of a Polson woman a few years before. The men claimed that they were innocent in Father Kerrigan's disappearance, and after a thorough investigation into the 2, they were cleared by police. Police were also investigating a suspect who lived out of state at the time, but this man was never publicly identified or arrested in connection with his disappearance. There has been speculation among podcasters and the media that these murders were somehow connected to Father Reynaldo. Father Carrier and Father Ryan were both killed within close proximity to Santa Fe. Father Ryan's car was found in Hobbs, which is about 300 miles from where Father Reynaldo was lured from St. Francis Cathedral. Father Ryan was murdered in December of 1981. Father Rivera was murdered in August of 1982. Father Carrier was killed in November of that year. At first glance, it does seem like there could be a connection between them, and the media insists that there is a link between all 3 of them. And William Toomey, who committed suicide in December of 1982 in Boise, Idaho. And while there are similarities between the 3, both Father Ryan and Father Kerrigan were found with their hands bound, and autopsy on Father Rivera would later reveal that his hands had been bound at some point with a wire coat hanger that was found not far from his body. But the similarities seem to end there. Father Rivera's body was found fully clothed with a gunshot wound to the chest. There was no apparent struggle. Father Ryan and Father Carrier were both found naked with their hands bound. Similar to the murders of Father Ryan and Father Carrier, Father Reynaldo's car was found abandoned a few days later. But it wouldn't be unusual for someone to take a vehicle after the murder. None of them seemed to be targeted. Father Carrier, Father Ryan, and Father Reynaldo seemed to all be victims of circumstance. Father Carrier and Father Ryan both had a propensity to pick up hitchhikers, while Father Rivera was called from the church to minister last rites. The investigators' crime board at the New Mexico State Police Office must have looked like a spider web woven across an entire room while investigating the connections between Father Carrier, Father Ryan, Reverend Anderson, and later, Father Kerrigan. And then there's William Toomey. How does he fit in? All leads had to be followed, and they definitely were. Gilbert Ulivari flew to Texas and spoke with investigators about Father Ryan's murder. He also spoke with James Henry Reyes in connection with Father Rivera's death. He went to Yuma and spoke to investigators there about Father Carrier's murder. he came up with more dead ends. The most promising lead came from Father Kerrigan's disappearance. Gilbert Ulibarri was convinced for many years that the deaths of Father Kerrigan and Father Rivera were connected. The wire coat hangers, Father Rivera's body being left in the open, and Father Kerrigan's clothing being staged near the highway. The cars were taken and abandoned on desolate roads, money and valuables left behind. Both Father Rivera and Father Kerrigan had spent time in Jemez Springs, New Mexico. Father Rivera was a parish priest, but Father Kerrigan was being treated as the servants of the Paracletes. There were plenty of similarities, but there were critical differences, and those differences would separate the two murders in Eric Lucero's mind. The first major difference was that Father Kerrigan's body was never found. Father Rivera's body was placed in a way that it seemed like it was meant to be found. The second and the most profound difference between the two, Father Kerrigan was at the congregation of the Paracletes to be treated for pedophilia. He was at the congregation in 1983, the year after Father Rivera's death, so there was no chance that they knew one another. In 2015, the Archdiocese released the names of several parish priests who had allegations of sexual abuse against them, and Father Kerrigan was one of those priests. We may never know if Father Kerrigan was targeted, but the allegations against him would have made that entirely possible. Lucero and Ulibarri would be at odds over whether these murders were connected for several years, but in an interview with KRQE News in Albuquerque in 2016, Ulibarri would be asked if he felt there was a connection between the two and would say, "No, I don't believe there is." When interviewed for the 40th anniversary of Father Reynaldo's death in 2022, he was asked again. This time his answer was far more definitive. No, he said, but would say nothing further about why or what changed his mind. In 2019, Yuma police announced that there was new evidence in Father Carrier's murder. They didn't say what it was or who it involved, but the news report gave hope that maybe after 40 years, his murder would be solved. 10 years after James Henry Reyes was wrongfully convicted of Father Ryan's murder, all the evidence in his case was destroyed. Father Ryan deserves better. The identity of William Toomey remains a mystery, as does his involvement with the murdered priest in the Southwest. Could he have murdered Father Ryan and Father Rivera, and then gone to Montana to murder Reverend Anderson, and then back to Arizona to kill Father Carrier? Some would like us to believe that he could, but it does seem a bit like a stretch to me. He could have been involved with Father Ryan, Father Rivera, and Father Carrier, but even that seems doubtful. There are too many differences, too much speculation. Father Kerrigan remains missing. There doesn't seem to be a lot of movement in his case at all, at least not since 2015 when police found that he was accused of sexual abuse. There have been several podcast episodes after 2015 and they all try to link him back to Father Rivera, but that was a connection even Gilbert Ulibarri abandoned long ago. The connection could never be proven. These similarities and overlapping evidence were no more than coincidence. As for where Father Reynaldo stands, new evidence has come to light over the past few years, but as in Father Carrier's case, police aren't saying much about it. Hope remains. Hope that 2 40-year-old cases will be solved. Faith that at least 2 murdered priests will find justice. And love from the communities who still mourn the murdered priests who brought their congregations so much joy. Next time, we'll begin the timeline for the investigation that took police all over the United States. Thanks for listening, and stay safe, New Mexico.